What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
I can tell you the exact moment the wobble in my voice disappeared and the part of me that keeps the books and pays the bills took over, because it was when my sister cleared her throat like she was about to announce a raffle winner and said, in that customer service tone she uses when she wants to sound kind while doing something mean, that I should skip Christmas this year because I would bring the mood down, and then she added the line that landed like a cheap slap, that nobody wanted any pity cases around, which was rich coming from people who could not keep a light on without my quiet help, so I let the silence stretch just long enough to make her think I might cry, and then I said okay, not mad, not pleading, just okay. And I swear I felt the old habit of apologizing for other people's choices leave my body like breath I forgot I was holding. If you have ever been the reliable one, the one with the stable job and the calendar for everyone's appointments and the emergency fund that somehow became everyone's emergency fund, then you know the exhaustion that feels normal until someone goes ahead and calls you a burden, because that word does not just sting, it rearranges the furniture in your head and shows you where the exits are, and as she kept talking about how it was for the best, and no hard feelings, I thought about the transfers I had set up like clockwork, the ones that smoothed over the late fees and the scary envelopes, and I felt this calm, steady click inside me, the sound of a lock sliding into place. And I understood that if they were comfortable labeling me the pathetic one, then they were comfortable believing a lie that I had been funding. She tried to soften it with that fake bright tone people use when they want to do harm without looking like the villain, saying we could catch up in the new year and maybe grab a coffee, and I said sure, keeping my voice even. But in my head I was replaying the little financial map I have memorized, which starts with my parents' mortgage shortfall that I cover every month without fanfare, passes through the utility bill I autopay because the heat got shut off one winter and I swore I would never let them sit in the dark again, then curves around my brother's car insurance, because he is still one traffic stop away from a crisis, and ends with my sister's authorized user card on my account that she calls a safety net for groceries, though somehow it swipes a lot more often at salons and weekend getaways than it does at checkout lines, and as the map unfolded in my mind I felt the smallest smile touch my face, the kind that says I am not showing my hand, not yet. I did not litigate the past or remind her of the hospital copay I covered or the rent gap that one July. I did not beg for space at a table I bought half the food for last year. I did not give her the satisfaction of hearing me justify my existence. I just said okay and let her hang up first, and when the call ended, I set my phone on the counter and stood there with the quiet humming like a fridge late at night. And I thought about how grown adults had let me become the padding around there. Worst habits and how quickly they pivoted to framing me as dead weight when I finally needed the kind of kindness I hand out like breath mints. Here is what nobody tells you about being the dependable one. You collect receipts in your head even when you do not want to, not out of spite, but because numbers and dates and patterns keep you safe, and the pattern here was simple and ugly. That my family preferred the version of me that funded the gaps and kept the peace, and they were allergic to the version of me that had needs, boundaries, and inconvenient truths, and once you see that, you cannot unsee it, because it clarifies everything, like turning on a light in a room you have walked through in the dark for years, and finally noticing the furniture you kept bruising your shins on. I remember thinking, with a kind of tired humor that felt new and clean, that if I was a pity case, then their bank statements were sympathy cards I had been writing to them every month. And since they were so eager to keep the party upbeat without my sad little presence, maybe they could keep the party upbeat without the money that quietly arrived like Santa with a spreadsheet, and I know that sounds sharp, maybe even petty. But it did not feel petty in that moment, it felt precise, like tightening a loose screw on a door that squeaks every time you walk through it, because nothing about what I did next was impulsive, it was the opposite. It was me recognizing that I had been trained to confuse generosity with duty and duty with silence. And I was done being quiet. I opened the bank app the way you open a junk drawer you have promised yourself you will organize, with purpose and a tiny spark of satisfaction. And I scrolled past the list of recurring payments with names that should never have been my responsibility, but had become my routine, and I paused on the authorized user section where my sister's name sat like a permanent guest on a couch she did not pay for. And I clicked through the little confirmations that ask if you're sure, and I read each one carefully, not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted the words to land. I wanted to hear the question and answer it with clarity. Yes, I am sure. And when it asked me for a security code, I typed it slowly and felt the steadiness in my hands. And then I pressed remove and watched the name vanish, not in triumph, but in relief, because that was ground I never should have seeded in the first place. I did not text her a warning or a speech. I did not announce a lesson or put on a performance. I let the action sit there like a closed tab while I went back to the home screen where the rest of the transfers waited. And I will be honest with you because you asked for honesty. My heart was pounding and my cheeks were hot, not from fear, but from the energy you get when you stop defending yourself and start defending your life. And even though part of me whispered that this might make everything explode, another part of me, the older and wiser part, said that maybe an explosion was the only honest thing left between us. I put the phone down again and looked at the clock. I did not even need to read, because I already knew that my sister liked to do her big grocery runs on weeknights, using my card like a key that always fit. And I pictured her at checkout reaching for a thing she had started to believe belonged to her, and I did not gloat. I just breathed in and let the new reality land. The one where I am not the pity case, and I am not the bank either. I am a woman who finally listened to herself, and as the quiet settled, I realized I was not done, not by a long shot, because the grocery card was only the first thread, and once you start pulling the first thread, you already know what you are going to do with the whole sweater. When I say I had been the safety net for so long that my own life started to look like a side project, I am not being dramatic. I am just telling you the math of it. Because once you build a habit of stepping in every time a bill is a little late or a tire blows at the wrong time or a deductible eats someone's savings, you stop noticing how often you are doing it and how invisible it has made you. And the strange thing is that invisibility becomes comfortable until someone calls you a pity case. And just like that, you realize the whole arrangement only worked because you never asked to be seen as a person who had limits, feelings, and a right to say no. My mother used to say I had a good head, which was her way of praising the results without acknowledging the weight of what produced them. So when the mortgage statement came in with that red warning bar one winter and my parents were already rehearsing the worried voices, I called the servicer, set up a recurring top-up from my account, and told them to relax, that it was handled. And after that, nobody asked where the money came from because comfort trains people faster than lectures ever do. And before long there was also the utility autopay in my name, because I could not stand the thought of shut-off notices in their mailbox. Then the medical card that never left my wallet because somebody had to keep track of copays before they spiraled into collections, and it did not feel like heroics or even sacrifice. It felt like what the eldest does when the youngest is still figuring life out and the middle child is busy performing responsibility without actually touching it. My brother, who is charming in that way that lets people overlook facts, found himself with a car he loved and an insurance premium he hated. And he was very sincere when he told me he would pay me back out of the side gig that never quite turned into the main gig. And I believed him because I always want to believe that a promise is worth something. So I set another transfer with a note in my calendar to revisit it in a few months, and the months slipped by because every time I looked up there was a new crisis labeled urgent, and it is astonishing how quickly a family will let one person become the administrator of everyone's emergencies while still treating her as the least accomplished person at the table, which, if we are being honest, suited them fine because it let them keep their pride while I kept their balances above water. My sister, who tells people she is independent because she pays for her own streaming services, became an authorized user on my card during a rough patch that seemed to last as long as an era. And I watched the transactions roll in with names that did not sound like groceries or essentials, but I swallowed my annoyance because peace is expensive and I had been taught to fund it. And every time I thought about drawing a line, I would remember a late-night phone call from years back when she was stranded and terrified, and I drove across town without thinking twice, and somewhere in that memory I decided that keeping a door open was the same as keeping love alive. Which is a beautiful idea right up until it becomes a revolving door where the only person getting dizzy is you. So when she called me a pity case and packaged my absence as a favor to the room, something old and patient in me sat up and asked for inventory, not because I wanted to rub anyone's nose in the ledger, but because I needed to answer a very simple question, which was whether the version of me they insisted on being embarrassed by was the same version currently keeping their lives stitched together, and the answer, once I let myself see it, was almost funny, because it meant that the person they had just disinvited from Christmas was the person their Christmas actually depended on, not emotionally, which they seemed done with, but structurally, which they had not thought through at all. I wish I could tell you I felt pure righteousness right then, but it was messier than that, because the truth is I have a soft spot the size of a small town for my father when he goes quiet with worry, and for my mother when she pretends she is not scared. And for my brother when he tries to turn a problem into a joke so he does not have to see it straight on, and even for my sister when she performs competence while texting me from the parking lot asking if I can send something, just this once. And, because those soft spots exist, I argued with myself for a while, asking whether pulling the plug would make me the kind of person I promised I would never be, the kind who teaches lessons with cruelty. And then I thought about the word pity and how casually it left my sister's mouth, and how quickly my parents let it stand, and I decided that refusing to be used is not cruelty, it is clarity, and clarity is not a lesson delivered with a slap. It is a boundary drawn with a steady hand. That night, I opened the spreadsheet I keep for my own sanity, the one that tracks what goes where and when and why, and I did something I had not allowed myself to do in years, which was to calculate the total of what I put out every month and compare it to what I told myself I could afford, and the gap looked like the outline of my missing self. And I realized I had been funding a version of family that did not include me as a person, only as an account, so I started drafting a plan that was not about revenge fireworks or dramatic speeches, but about quiet control, step by step, lever by lever, the kind of plan that restores gravity so that everyone feels the pull of their own choices again. I wrote a simple script I could follow when the guilt crept in, a few lines that reminded me nobody had been protecting me when I ran lean to cover their shortfall, that nobody had checked if I was sleeping when they asked for a transfer before dawn. That love without respect is just dependency with better branding, and then, because I promised myself each step would be clean and specific, I took a single action that would signal, not announce, the end of the old arrangement, and I logged into the mortgage servicer where my recurring top-up lived like a secret pact, and I revoked my authorization with 2 confirmations and 1 final check, no notes, no warning, no speech. Just the quiet click of a door closing that never should have been left open in the first place, and as soon as the confirmation email landed, I knew the first ripple would hit sooner than anyone expected. And I also knew it would not hit the person everyone assumes is the weakest link, because families like mine have a way of hiding who really depends on what, and the first alert was already heading toward someone who never thought the rules applied to her. There is a certain kind of silence that settles in your chest when you finally accept that you do not owe explanations to people who would never listen anyway. And that was the silence I carried with me the morning I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the familiar list of recurring transfers glowing back at me. Each line a quiet reminder of how deeply I had entangled myself in other people's responsibilities, and instead of feeling guilt the way I used to, I felt something steadier. Something that could only be described as the sense of finally taking my own side, because every name, every due date, every automatic withdrawal confirmed had always been less about generosity and more about a story I had been telling myself that my worth came from holding everyone else together, and now I was rewriting that story with the simplest gesture in the world. I was canceling, one by one, the lifelines they had mistaken for entitlements. I remember the mortgage top-up was the first on the list, not because it was the heaviest, though it was, but because it had been the one that convinced me years ago that if I did not step in, disaster would follow. And so I became addicted to the idea that only I stood between my parents and ruin, and I suppose in a way it was true, but it was also true that they learned to lean without learning to balance. So when I hovered over the button that would terminate the recurring payment, I did not tremble or second guess. I simply thought about the fact that no one had hesitated to exclude me from Christmas with the label of a pity case, and if I was pitiful in their eyes, then I might as well stop being useful in their accounts. And with a steady hand I clicked confirm, watched the screen refresh, and felt a quiet surge of relief that surprised me with its calmness. Next came the utilities, which I had taken over after one particularly cold winter when the heating bill had been ignored so long that the company actually came to the door with a shut-off notice. And I was horrified enough to vow it would never happen again, which of course it didn't, because I set up a direct debit that made sure of it. But as I stared at the autopay record now, I realized that by removing the consequences, I had also removed their incentive to manage themselves, and in protecting them from the cold, I had placed myself in a position where my own warmth was never considered. So I clicked cancel again, and the thought that they might actually feel the draft this time did not bring me joy, but it did bring me clarity. Because maybe the cold air would remind them that the comfort they treated as natural had always been engineered by the person they were too proud to invite to the table. The medical expenses came next, which carried a different weight, because I remembered sitting in a waiting room with my father years ago, his hands shaking as he tried to sign paperwork he did not understand, and me quietly sliding my card across the counter so the receptionist would stop asking questions he could not answer, and I admit that moment was harder to erase, because it was tied not just to money, but to fear and dignity. And for a few minutes I almost convinced myself that continuing to cover those costs was the humane thing to do, but then the memory of my sister's dismissive tone intruded again, and I realized that if I allowed myself to keep one thread out of sympathy, the entire net would hold together. And nothing would change, so I reminded myself that grown adults are capable of arranging their own care and their own bills, and I severed that line too, not because I stopped caring about their health, but because I could no longer accept being treated as disposable, while funding the very systems that kept them safe. And then, inevitably, I reached the account where my brother's car insurance sat, deducted every month like a subscription he never thanked me for, and I thought about how many times he bragged about his independence, about how he managed to take care of himself, all while I was quietly making sure he was never one payment away from losing his license, and I felt an almost bitter laugh rise in my throat, because the irony of a man who prided himself on freedom being tied to my debit card was too sharp to ignore, so I cut that cord too, leaving him to discover, probably the next time he tried to renew his registration, that the net he assumed was permanent had vanished without a sound. The final step, though, was my sister's authorized user status on my credit card, the one I had already removed once, but had to double-check, because I knew her well enough to expect she might try to argue her way back into my accounts with guilt or charm. And as I confirmed once more that her name no longer lived on my profile, I felt the kind of satisfaction that doesn't come with victory, but with restoration, like moving furniture back into the right rooms after years of living in chaos, and it was in that moment that I realized the act of canceling was not about punishing them. It was about reminding myself that I was not put on this earth to subsidize disrespect. I closed the laptop slowly, not with the drama of someone slamming a door, but with the calm of someone locking it and putting the key in her own pocket for the first time, and I sat back, hands in my lap, and thought about the silence that would follow when the first automatic payments failed, and the emails started rolling in, and the panicked voices began leaving voicemails, and I knew then that the fallout was not just going to be financial. It was going to be emotional, because for the first time in years they were going to feel the absence of me not as a shadow at the Christmas table, but as the missing foundation under their daily lives, and if they thought disinviting me was simple, they were about to learn how complicated life becomes when the person you cast aside decides she is done holding you up. And here is the part that still lingers with me, the part that makes my chest tighten when I think about it. I did not send a single warning text, I did not hint, I did not prepare them with a lecture about fairness. I just let the cancellations exist like invisible dominoes waiting to fall, because I wanted them to discover the truth in the most honest way possible, not from my words, but from the absence of my money, and that absence, I knew, was going to be louder than any argument I could ever make. The first tremor did not come from where I expected, because I thought my parents' mortgage would spike first or my brother's insurance would throw a fit. Yet the earliest vibration came from my sister at a checkout lane where she had built a routine on muscle memory. Since she had learned to move her life through the world with the confidence of someone who believes a plastic rectangle in her wallet is a permanent extension of her identity rather than a privilege I extended, and when the decline hit, she texted me in that snappy tone that confuses entitlement with urgency, writing that something must be wrong with the bank and that I should fix it right now because she had a full cart and a line behind her, and I read the message twice. Not because I was unsure of my decision, but because the casual command reminded me how easily I had taught them to pull my attention like a fire alarm. So I put the phone down and did not reply, and somewhere between her second and third text, the tone shifted from brisk to panicked to scolding, as if my silence were a kind of misbehavior, and when she finally wrote, "Do not do this to me," I understood she still believed this was a game of moods rather than a rebalancing of reality. By the end of that afternoon, my brother called with an edge he usually saves for customer service representatives, announcing that his policy was flagged for non-payment and asking if I had changed something by accident. And I told him I had not done anything by accident in a very long time, which he did not appreciate, so he rolled into a speech about how I was sabotaging him and how he had work obligations that required a car. And he kept pausing for me to jump in with an apology and a promise to fix it, and when I did not, he moved to the old family hits, the ones about loyalty and what family does for family, and I could hear the old version of myself walking toward the trap with a credit card in her hand. But I stayed exactly where I was and said that grown men can call their insurance carriers and settle their own accounts, and when he swore under his breath and threatened to block my number, I said that would be his choice and that I would accept it. And the line went dead with the kind of thud that tells you just ended a long, silent contract you never signed. My parents took longer to arrive at panic, partly because they live in that soft fog where problems get opened slowly like mail you do not want to read, and partly because I had removed so many sharp edges for so many years that they had forgotten envelopes can hurt. But once the mortgage bank sent a courtesy email about a missing supplemental payment and the utility company followed with a friendly reminder that friendliness only lasts until a due date is crossed, my mother left a voicemail. Using her church voice, kind and careful and full of suggestion rather than request, telling me she knew I was busy and that things must have slipped, and my father texted a thumbs up and then a question mark, which is his way of saying that he wants everything handled without having to say the words out loud, and I stood in my kitchen listening to that voicemail and reading that question mark, and I realized I was not actually angry anymore. I was clear, which is different. Because clarity does not argue and it does not plead, it only decides. So I replied to my mother with a single sentence that said she should contact her providers directly because I was no longer involved in their bills. And after a pause long enough to measure the distance between old roles and new boundaries, she wrote back asking if I was upset about Christmas, and I answered that I had already accepted their decision and that I wished them a good holiday. And then I put my phone on Do Not Disturb because if I did not build some quiet on purpose, they were going to fill every corner with noise. The family group chat, which rarely lit up except when someone wanted to coordinate a potluck or praise a new baby, exploded like a circuit pushed past its rating. And my sister performed a concerned act for the room while privately messaging me with a string of accusations that revealed more than she meant to, because she kept using words like "oh" and "duty" and "baseline," as if my money were not help but a tax. And my brother stepped in with a lecture about how I always have to make things dramatic, and my mother typed that she hated conflict and wished we could just be together, which would have felt sincere if the last time we spoke she had not co-signed the idea that my presence would poison the mood. And right when I was deciding whether to say anything at all, my father wrote that family means stepping up, and I felt that old heat in my chest, the one that used to send me sprinting toward my wallet, and I noticed how different it felt now. Not as a demand to rescue, but as a signal to stop, because if family means stepping up, then it also means stepping back when stepping up turns you into a doormat. I did take one extra step that afternoon, not vindictive, Not flashy, just smart, because I know my sister and I know my brother and I know that when panic meets entitlement it sometimes dresses up as creativity, so I called the mortgage servicer, the utility company, and the bank and placed a verbal password on any conversation about my old authorizations, which meant that anyone who tried to pretend to be me or to use my past permissions would run into a wall I built out of a single word. And if you think that sounds extreme, I can tell you that I have already gotten the kind of late-night call where a familiar voice tries to move past security by throwing around phrases like urgent and family, and she meant to, and I am done with that stage of the play. So a password is not spite, it is a deadbolt. The second step, and this is the part that made me laugh in a way that tasted like relief, was that I finally used the spreadsheet I kept like a confession ledger for something other than self-flagellation, because I turned it into a one-page summary with dates, amounts, and the exact language from their messages asking for help, scrubbed of anything emotional and stripped to the clean lines of cause and effect, and I dropped it into the group chat with a short note that said this is what you called pity. This is what you called mood, and effective immediately each balance returns to its owner, which was not a sermon or a threat but a mirror, and as soon as it landed my brother went quiet, my mother typed and erased bubbles without sending. And my sister, who never misses a chance to reframe a story, posted that I was making everyone uncomfortable with my accounting, and I said that discomfort is just recognition with its shoes off, and I meant it. By the time evening came around, they had organized themselves into a kind of impromptu tribunal where they could rehearse their lines and try to funnel me back into my part, and the messages turned into a demand for a call where they could all be present. And I agreed with a calm that felt almost foreign in my own mouth, because I already knew I was not walking in empty-handed, since along with the password locks and the ledger I had something else that none of them had considered and that I had kept quiet out of habit until now, a final piece of leverage that was not about punishment or humiliation, but about truth with consequences, and as I set the time and put my phone face down, I thought about how sweet it is to enter a room with a trump card you did not even need to wave yet, and how much sweeter it is to know that the card only exists because you finally decided to stop confusing love with rescue. And I slept well for the first time in a long time, knowing that tomorrow we're going to learn what it sounds like when the person you called a pity case starts telling the story out loud. They wanted a call with everyone on, so I answered at the agreed time and listened to the chorus of familiar breaths while I decided, calmly and without apology, that I would not fill the space with explanations they had no intention of hearing, and when my mother, Diane, started with the soft voice she uses when she wants me to fix something without admitting anything happened, I let her finish the part about misunderstandings and timing and Christmas stress before I said that. Misunderstandings do not use passwords, cancellations do not happen by accident, and stress does not swipe a card, so we could either talk like adults about choices and consequences, or we could end the call and let the consequences do the talking for us. And when she went quiet, my father, Mark, jumped in with the old line that family steps up, and I said family also stops stepping in when stepping in becomes stepping on, and if that sounded harsh, then maybe we were finally getting somewhere. Near the truth. Katie, who does not enjoy silence unless she created it, took her turn with a performance about how humiliating it was to have a card decline at a register, and how I could have given her a heads up because she had plans that night. And I told her that my heads up was delivered the moment she called me a pity case and disinvited me from the holiday, like I was a risk to the appetizers, and when she tried to pivot into the story where I am too sensitive and should not take things personally, I said that words are personal when they are said directly into your ear, and the payoff for talking like that is that the person you demean stops paying for your comfort, which is not revenge, it is alignment, and she started to protest that she did not mean it. And I said the register believed you did, because it listened to the numbers, and the numbers finally matched the respect on offer, which was none. Liam did his usual routine where he starts like a diplomat and ends like a bouncer, telling me he had work obligations and a car that cannot run on inspirational quotes, and that I had put him in a bad spot with the insurance pull. And I said that he was in a bad spot long before I pressed a button because grown men who brag about independence while leaning on their sister's debit card have been in a bad spot for years. only the lighting was flattering, and now it is daylight, so he can call the carrier and handle his balance the way an adult does, and if he would like a script, I can offer a simple one that starts with "I owe you money" and ends with "Here is how I will pay it." And he cursed under his breath and tried to bait me into a back and forth about fairness, and I told him fairness finally entered the chat the minute the funding left. My father cleared his throat and asked if I really wanted to be the kind of person who lets bills go unpaid around the holidays, and I said I did not let anything go. I returned ownership to its rightful place, and then, because I promised myself I would bring truth with proof and not just slogans, I told them I had something they needed to hear before they said one more word, and the call got very quiet in that way that reminds you how often you have filled the silence for other people. And I said the following very slowly so no one could pretend they missed it, that I had revoked all authorizations permanently, that I had added verbal passwords to every account that ever touched my name or my credit, that I had frozen my credit with all 3 bureaus so any attempt to open, extend, or piggyback would fail with a flag, that I had stepped down in writing as medical proxy and financial power for both parents so they would need to designate someone who respects them enough to show up without strings, and that I had created a paper trail for every transfer I ever made with dates, notes, and the messages where they asked me to cover what they now call pity, and that if anyone tried to smear me to the extended family, or at church, or anywhere else, I would share that ledger once, without commentary, and then I would go silent again, and the part of me that used to tremble waited for the explosion, and felt nothing but steadiness when it did not come. Katie tried to laugh in that brittle way she does when she knows she lost the room, asking if I planned to turn this into a courtroom drama, and I said no. I plan to turn it into a very boring new reality where everyone pays their own bills, and I do not subsidize people who exclude me, and then call it love, and since we were on the topic of new realities, I told them about the other change I had already made, which was that the money I had budgeted for their recurring rescues now moves every month to a local mutual aid fund for single caregivers and an emergency grant at the community college in Grandma Ruth's name, because she was the last person in this family who knew how to help without humiliation. And I would rather honor her by helping people who do not use pity like a weapon, and if they felt embarrassed by that, perhaps embarrassment is simply clarity knocking on the door at last. My mother said that felt cruel, and I told her that cruelty is taking from someone and calling her pitiful when she finally asks for kindness, while boundaries are what happens when the person you took from learns how to use the word no. And if that distinction felt uncomfortable, it was because she had not had to confront it before. And then my father tried one last reach for control by saying that when people leave the family moves on without them, and I said that sounded like a threat and a blessing at the same time, because what I was leaving was a role, not a family, and what I was claiming was a life, and if moving on meant learning to stand on their own legs, then I wished them a swift recovery. Liam muttered that I would come running the first time something serious happened, and I said that the first time something serious happens, they can call the person who decided I was bad for the mood and ask her to host more than a holiday, because I will not be anyone's back pocket anymore. And Katie started to spit something ugly and swallowed it when I said her first name in the tone I have never used with her, which was not angry or pleading but final, and I told her directly that if she ever attempts to use my name to move money or to gain access or to bend a policy, I will file a report and proceed without hesitation, and she whispered that I would not do that to my own sister. And I said I already did the kindest thing I could do for my sister, which was to stop keeping her soft by paying for the hard parts. There was one last thing I needed to do, and I saved it for the end because I wanted it to land as quietly as a door that is never opening again, so I told them that I would not attend any calls, chats, or meetings for a while. That if they needed to say something important, they could write a message that contained an apology, a plan, and a date, that I was not interested in amends without actions, and that until such messages existed I would keep my phone on filters and my heart on peace. And then I thanked them for their time and wished them a good holiday season and pressed end, not with anger, but with the kind of relief you only get after you have carried something heavy for years and finally set it down. They tried a few times that week, and a cousin reached out to say there was drama and did I want to weigh in, and I sent her the same one-page ledger I sent in the group chat followed by a short note that said I am fine. They will be fine too. And then I closed my laptop and made myself dinner and sat in a quiet that did not feel like punishment anymore. It felt like ownership. And here is the part one hope you understand if you have ever been the person who holds everyone's world together while yours flickers at the edges, that when the fallout came and the payments missed and the apologies did not arrive, I did not gloat or pace or replay speeches. I just kept my promise to myself, and the promise was simple. That I would never again pay for a seat at a table where I am discussed like a problem, and that I would use my money and my time the way I use my voice now, deliberately, cleanly, completely. So that when I look back at this season, I will not think about the party I skipped. I will think about the moment I learned that the final move in a master plan does not have to be loud to be brilliant, it only has to be final.